Hi, in this video we're going to talk a little bit more about storyboards. There are some traps that you can get into. For example, in the second scene of our storyboard app here, the same one that we dealt with last time, I have placed a back button. And the purpose of this back button is to go back to the first storyboard. However, you might conceptually think, well, what if I just control and drag from the back button, and I'll have to be in full view that way, but what if I just control and drag from the back button back to the first scene and then assign a modal segue there? And so my entire outline would look like something like this. Well, this will work. Functionally, it will work. But what really happens here is that when we click the back button, we are instantiating a new instance of our view controller, of our first scene. And then when we click the new scene button, we instantiate a new instance of our second scene. And when we click the back button, we instantiate a new instance of the first scene, and so on and so forth. And the problem is that memory could fill up, and it might cause some problems with memory overflows, especially in applications where we have a lot of scenes. So this is not the correct way to handle this. So we want to go back to our second scene and delete that action, that modal segue. So the question is, how do we do this? How do we get from the second scene, back to the first scene? Well, the answer is that we have a new icon here, and this is called the exit icon, and it is really an unwinding segue. Now, we need to use this and bind it to a method in our view controller, and it's our first view controller. Remember, we don't have a second view controller. So we're going to make an action method, and I'm just going to call it go back. So this returns IB action, and I'm just going to call it go back, and the ID, and this must be of type UI storyboard segue. It's a pointer, and I can again just use center. Now something magical happens. I want this to go back to the first view controller. So I can just define this method empty. Now, of course, I can do things in this method, but for now, I'm just going to define my go back method. I'll pull that off, and I'll just define it this way. Now, and we'll save the header file. Now, if I go to my main storyboard instance and control, click, and drag not to the other view controller, as I would have before, but to the exit button. Let me scroll down so I can see that. Now we see that the exit button is willing to bind, and it's binding to that go back action method. When we have a new UI storyboard parameter segue parametered IB action method, it will bind to this exit method, or this exit button, and it asks me what I want to choose, and I want to choose that go back segue, and it binds that. Now we can see that exit now has an unwind segue from back to exit. Now notice that exit wasn't bound to this method of the view controller. It just knows. It accepts this. And if I go back into my view controller .header file, I see that it looks as if this doesn't have any binding at all. And this is a slight bug in Xcode. I consider it a bug because this should show that it is indeed bound. But now when I run my application, I am releasing the second view to go back to the first view. And so I don't have an issue of potentially filling up memory with instances of my first view, then my second view, and my first view, as I would have if I had done it the other way. So we go to the new scene, and then when I click the back button, it's using that Unwind Segue to go back. Now, we can also, if we had other scenes in our storyboard, we could also use this method, go back, to unwind it to a specific scene in the storyboard. So we could do display modal view controller so-and-so, or we could unwind to such and such modal view controller, and so forth. So I wanted you to be aware of this because it is very typical when starting to work with storyboards to just merely connect storyboards in a circular fashion or in a figure eight fashion, where one storyboard releases to another storyboard and we think that it's going back to the original instance, but in fact it's instantiating a new instance of the first storyboard. Thank you very much.